publish that. That's all right. Luke chapter 2. And I believe that we could just begin at verse 39. You know what's transpired prior to this, as Jesus was taken while a baby to the temple in Jerusalem, and the prophecies of Simeon, and then the appearance of Anna as well. So we come to verse 39, which is the return to Nazareth. Verse 39 says, when they had performed everything according to the law of the Lord. All right. So what does this tell us?
Thoroughly completed following God.
Yep. Which means, what do we know about Mary and Joseph?
Holy people.
Yep. They are people that kept the law. Now, we might say, well, but they're the parents of Messiah. Surely they don't have to keep the law, do they? But they did. In fact, Jesus did as well. So they performed everything according to the law of the Lord. I think I mentioned to you before that Luke uses this term, the law of the Lord, a number of times in these couple of chapters. So they fulfilled all the requirements of the Mosaic law. And having done that, then it says they returned to Galilee, to their own city of Nazareth. And you can see on the map the distance between Jerusalem and Nazareth. And I have to tell you, it's not as far as you think. When we arrived in Israel and saw the itinerary, that on one morning we are on one extreme of Israel, and there was planned for us to be on the other extreme of Israel that day, and then another direction. I thought, how are we going to cover that much territory in one day? Well, it's because Israel's a very small country. You look at a map like this and compare it to Ohio or something, but it's not. I think it's about 80 some miles from Jerusalem to Nazareth, if you go straight. All right, so they returned to that city. Now, the town of Nazareth isn't even mentioned in the Old Testament because it was unsettled. No one lived there until the reign of John Hyrcanus, who is one of the Hasmonean family following the War of the Maccabees, the Maccabean revolt. So, and that was only 130 BC. So Nazareth hadn't been there very long, really. It was a new town. And of course, as we go to this point, we know that looking at other gospels, that Luke totally omits the threat of Herod the Great, the sojourn in Egypt, and the reasons for returning to Nazareth. He just says they went back to Nazareth. If you want to know all that, you have to look in particularly Matthew. And of course, their own city of Nazareth, that's where they came from to begin with, as you remember.
That's where Nathaniel said, what good can come out of Nazareth?
Yeah, yeah. Because it's a new town, and it's in Gentile territory, and wasn't known for being a place where good people live. Verse 40, the child continued to grow and become strong, increasing in wisdom, and the grace of God was upon him. I think I'm on the wrong slide. No, okay. I thought I had a slide for this verse, but I don't. All right, so what does that tell us? Verse 40. The child continued to grow and become strong. What does that indicate?
Some time had passed, he had grown. So.
Okay, so from the time they returned to Nazareth, now basically Luke is covering the intervening approximately 12 years. And during that 12 years, what happened?
Not just to grow, but to grow strong in the spirit.
Okay, first of all, how is he growing? What's the first way he's growing?
Physically.
Physically. What's the second way he's growing?
He's eating his Wheaties and stuff.
He's eating his Wheaties. What's the second way he's growing?
Spiritually.
Spiritually. In wisdom, we put that as spiritually, intellect may be a part of that as well. And then it says the grace of God was upon him. Now that might cause us to think a little bit. What does that mean? The grace of God was upon him. Did he need God's grace? You know, he doesn't need it from the standpoint of being a sinner. We think of a sinner needing God's grace, but how does Jesus, the God man, need God's grace?
My question exactly.
That's kind of difficult, isn't it?
Yeah.
And what is Luke trying to communicate to us here? I think what Luke is saying is that God was overseeing the whole thing, that God is with him. I think that's can be the summary of what Luke is trying to communicate.
ESV has the word favor. The favor of God was upon him. It's kind of like you're talking about overseeing and keeping things favorable.
Yeah, right. You think about one of the, let's see, who is it? Several authors, I guess I've looked at, looked into the accomplishments of Jesus intellectually and how he would have known at least 3 languages. He quotes extensively. When Jesus speaks from the Old Testament, he not only quotes the Hebrew Old Testament, he also quotes from the Septuagint, the Greek translation. He, of course, speaks Aramaic, the native language. He speaks Greek, as we can tell. And his knowledge, we're going to see indicated in a few verses, really knows no bounds. But it comes naturally. And I don't mean that from the standpoint of someone who is born smart. I mean, he didn't acquire it because he was God. You know, he wasn't born with the knowledge of the universe. He had to grow in that and grow in wisdom even. And that was helped by the fact that he did not have a sin nature. We'll talk about that in a minute though. But he certainly was able to function very well intellectually.
Yeah, he still had to learn just like you and I.
But he had to learn his
father, I'm sure, played a great role in him learning the
Yeah,
scripture.
he had to learn his Aleph Bates.
Right.
Gimels.
He still had that thing called the hypostatic union that was working.
Yeah.
He still was fully flesh and fully God at the same time.
Yeah,
Had to
exactly.
be
And,
natural.
and that's the mystery to us is how that happens. We have some indication of it in Philippians chapter 2. And I think we'll talk about that a little bit later. So that's a summary of what happens during those 12 years.
What he doesn't address is his dynamics with the rest of the family. That you've got a perfect sibling. How does that make you feel?
And we can only surmise the kind of relationship he might have had with his brothers. I mean, how many of you have ever lived with a sibling who never did anything wrong?
Your sister.
My
Yeah,
sister,
my sister did.
That was me.
my sisters and I used to pick on each other.
Scholars say that he didn't actually begin to put the pieces together until he was 12 years old.
Yeah, that's possible as we come here to the next verse. Jim, you gonna say something?
Well, I was just thinking, you know, as you're growing up and you're with your age group and stuff, the people that around him must have really been upset because he knew all this stuff,
Knew everything.
you know, and they were playing games like we would at that age, you know. I just can't imagine him, you know, he was doing all that and yet he was gaining all this knowledge. Where was the knowledge coming from? I mean, from God, but I mean, because the parents
Well,
weren't, I mean, they
It came from being in school, it came from studying himself, from listening. We're gonna see some of that in a few
Can
minutes
you,
as well.
can you imagine the brother and the sisters being mad at him? The mother keeps saying, why can't you be more like Jesus?
Yeah, exactly. Dave?
Well, oh, nice. Very good. You know, when we think about Easter, we think about the sacrifice that Christ made on the cross. There's always something that I always think about that I don't think a lot of people think about, was that it just wasn't the fact that he died on the cross, he suffered for us, but he was totally obedient his whole life. You know, and I think that's a miracle in itself, being 100% human. You know, he never sinned. And if he became that second Adam, and he did what the first Adam couldn't do or didn't do. And he was sinless. And that's as much of a miracle to me, that, you know, how many 12-year-olds do you know that don't sin? You know,
I mean, 2-year-olds, you know.
yeah, I mean,
was gonna say,
that's
that's when they get started, too.
that's amazing to me. That, you know, that
Terrible,
he was
terrible.
able to-
Yeah.
it was the first Adam couldn't do.
Well, Leonard said, made me think, Jesus never went through the terrible twos. So when Mary and Joseph had another kid, that what is this? All right, John.
I'm just zeroing in on that word wisdom.
Mhm.
And if we think of wisdom, and we think of what wisdom is, it's the fear of God. Well, this is God. So what was this wisdom that he was growing in?
Hmm.
It was the knowledge of the Father.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
The second part of the triune.
Mhm.
So we wonder where it all comes from. It comes from the human man also knowing the God
Mhm.
and growing as we do. When we learn about God, we grow in wisdom, we grow in knowledge of him. And we're like,
Yeah,
so
exactly.
I think that was an interesting choice of words there.
Yeah, I'm sure we could probably delve even deeper into the words Luke uses here, but we must move on if we're going to complete chapter 2 today, which I promised.
You are kidding, right?
All right, no, I have to, because I won't be here next week. I'm speaking at another church. So verse 41, we come to the return to Jerusalem. And initially we had the separation then in 41 to 45. Now his parents went to Jerusalem every year at the feast of the Passover.
Yeah.
Again, that tells us of the devotion of Mary and Joseph to the Lord. Because adult males were required to participate
Yeah.
in Passover, as well as a couple of other festivals that are mentioned here on the screen. Women were not required to be there, and yet Mary went, apparently year after year, and participated in the Passover sacrifice and the meal. The fact that both of them made this a yearly habit, of course, is an indication of their mutual piety. I'm not going to go into the details here of the different festivals and feasts that were required, unless you have a particular question. As you look over the information on the slide. The one-day Passover was followed by a 7-day feast of unleavened bread. So it made for a full week of being there in Jerusalem. But normally only the first 3 days were required, and then people could go home. But we're going to see apparently they stayed the whole time. Okay, verse 42, when he became 12, they went up there according to the custom of the feast. So Jesus went along with them as Mary and Joseph habitually went. This is probably in the year AD 9, when Coponius was the procurator. He was before Pontius Pilate, and Annas was the high priest. The fact that the age of 12 is specifically noted may suggest that this was a transition period. It depends on the information you read. The age of 12 is spoken of a number of times in the Old Testament even as being a crucial age. It's when Samuel began to prophesy, was at 12 years old. I know I read years ago and recently found a couple people who say that at that time that 12 was the age of maturity, and when a person or when a male became son of the law, rather than 13 as it is today. But there's certainly not any unanimity among scholars as to that. Most of them say that this was the year prior to him becoming a son of the law, which today is celebrated with bar mitzvah, as I'm sure you know. But that's not something that was initiated until the Middle Ages, the whole celebration and all that. But even if this is prior to his becoming officially a son of the law, in other words, an adult, this would have been good preparation, and Jewish families would prepare. I mean, they wouldn't just drop it on their kid. Hey, you're an adult now. Get out and get a job. It was a preparation year by year, training them towards that moment, and especially the last year or two prior to the obligatory traveling for Passover would take the child along so they knew what to expect when they came as an adult the next year. Okay, any questions or comments about that particular aspect? I thought maybe we would consider what Jesus experienced as he came to the city of Jerusalem. Because remember, he had been there as a baby, but certainly had no remembrance of that. And the first time of coming to Jerusalem, and this might be something that he would have seen, a scene like this, as you're approaching the Temple Mount, standing higher than the rest of the city, even as he is approaching for this very important event, the celebration of Passover. I'm not going to go into the detail I was thinking of again, because we need to finish chapter 2 today. But the gates of Jerusalem are important. There are a number of ways to get in. There's what's called the Jerusalem Gate. Many of them are still there. Here's a view of the eastern gate, of the Golden Gate, which is sealed up. The Arabs or the Muslims sealed that up. I can't remember how long ago, long time ago, because they had heard that the Messiah was going to come through the eastern gate, and so they blocked it up, supposedly. There's another view of it a little bit closer. And as you get beyond the gates in the city, then you come into these kind of colonnaded areas where people were selling things. A lot of traffic there. These are the malls of Jerusalem, if you will.
Bill?
Yeah.
I don't think that's going to stop him.
You don't think what?
I don't think that's going to stop him
Stop him?
from coming through the gate.
Oh, no.
I don't think
No.
it's going to stop him.
Oh, you're going back to the gate. I was thinking stop him from shopping. I wasn't sure we.
He won't be doing any
I know
shopping.
it took a few minutes to formulate that. Yeah. As if, right? The efforts of
The
humans.
graves are there for too.
Yeah, the graves are it's high priority to be buried on the Mount of Olives.
You become unclean if you walked on those graves to go to the gate, so they put the graveyard in front of the gate.
Oh, that part of it, yeah.
So that's why there's a cemetery in front of the gate too, in theory, so they're trying to lock them out.
Yeah. Yeah, I was thinking of the fact that the Jewish cemetery is on the Mount of Olives, which is nearby,
Yeah.
so they can be resurrected right there where the Messiah comes. Here are the steps at the southern wall of Jerusalem where a lot takes place. And I thought I would show you this model of Jerusalem that is near Jerusalem. Very impressive model to show you what things were like at the time of Jesus. There's looking down at the temple. You can see the court of the Gentiles, which is where people would come in. And the Gentiles were allowed only in this area. There's a wall, small wall, to keep them from going any further, and a sign on the wall saying, if you're a Gentile and go take a step in here, you're dead. And that was the one exception that the Romans made to Israel not being able to put people to death. They allowed if a Gentile stepped into there, they could put them to death immediately. The women's court is here. And of course, it was the court of the Gentiles. And you wonder if Jesus coming into the temple area for the first time as an adult or almost adult. If the merchants and money changers were there like they were when he came back later.
Yeah.
I imagine they were, and maybe it served him even then. then here's the women's court over here. There's an entrances, several places here to the temple area. Temple treasury is over here by the women's court. Remember that when Mary came to offer her sacrifice of cleansing of from childbirth, that she had to do an offering, and the trumpets are in that area right there. There's the Eastern Gate. And there's the treasury from another angle. And here's a picture of the trumpets, 13 trumpets that were there, and where people would put in their money. And that's where she would have done that as well. And then, of course, from the court of the women, there's the gate of Nicanor, which is near where Mary would have given her offering, and then stood near the gate as she heard the offering being given in here. And then went to the holy place in here, and the holy place in there. So that's the setup there. So Mary and Joseph are there with Jesus, and what happens? Verse 43, and as they were returning to Nazareth, after spending the full number of days, and that's, I mentioned before, I think this indicates that they were there the full 8 days, not just the obligatory 3. Although there's some disagreement about that. But I think they were there the whole time. And it says that the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem. Now, the fact that he's called boy here leads me to believe that maybe he had not become son of the law yet. Otherwise, it would not have used boy. I may be wrong, but that seems to indicate that. Although before I studied this recently, I would have thought that he already was a man. But I think that word mitigates something else. So he stayed behind, but his parents were unaware of it. 44, but supposed him to be in the caravan and went a day's journey. Now they supposed him to be there because that was the custom. Nobody traveled alone if you could help it. It was too dangerous. And so they traveled in groups. And so a whole group from Nazareth, family, friends, or whatever, traveled down, and then, they all gather together, travel back together. And so they assumed that he was in the caravan. Now, the caravans usually were made up such a way that the men were in the back so that they would not outdistance the women and children. If the men were first, pretty soon there would be a large gap between. It's like me on one of my trips with students. I'm always way ahead of them. And the women would have been in the front. And of course, they walk slower, partially because they maybe aren't as strong, but partially because they're talking all the time, I imagine. So they're going slower. The children are in between. But Jesus, being 12 years old, he could have been either with the men or the women.
Yeah.
And so they assumed he was with one or the other. And so they went a day's journey. And at the end of that day, and with a caravan like that, you travel a little more slowly than you would if you're just walking a couple of you together. And so a normal day's journey was over 20 miles, but it's probably more like 8 to 10 in a caravan. So that evening, they're going around with all the relatives looking for Jesus, and he's not there. Can't find him. Have you ever had that happen to you? Have you ever lost a child? I know we did once when my daughter was she about 2 in Erie, Beth? And we were living for the summer with my parents, and I had 3 siblings at home still. And so that necessitated at least 2, maybe 3 cars to church. And so coming home from church, we all came home, went into my parents' house to get ready for Sunday dinner. And, there's such a lot of people there. We're just doing that. And we get a phone call. Hello, this is so-and-so from the church. We have a little girl here What?
Embarrassing.
Everybody assumed that somebody else had picked her up.
Yeah.
And fortunately, it didn't do any lasting damage to her. She was happy anyway, so, but, it can happen. So they began looking for him among their relatives and acquaintances. In perfect tense, they continued to be looking. They're looking. And the word indicates from the bottom up, they're looking everywhere. That evening, verse 45, when they did not find him, they returned to Jerusalem looking for him. And presumably the next morning they start out. They wouldn't be traveling at night.
Mm-mm.
And so they were looking for him. They were making diligent search for him. And the present participle indicates that they were searching for him on the road while they're returning. And they get there and they continue looking. Verse 46. Then after 3 days, they found him in the temple. Now, I don't think that means 3 days in Jerusalem looking. I think that's including a day out, a day back, and then a day looking. It's possible the 3 days of looking, but not as likely to me. And they found him. The word is the word from which we get eureka.
Yeah.
We found him.
Yeah.
And where? In the temple. Now, where do you suppose they looked first? It took, it wasn't until the end of the third day that they found him. So where else were they looking?
Food markets.
Food markets? Yeah. I don't know, is there a candy store?
Playground.
Playground? The temple playground?
Yeah.
Now, if it had been one of your 12-year-old children, where would you have looked? With the animals.
Yeah.
If it had been you when you were 12, where would your parents have looked?
Candy. Looking for candy.
Looking for candy?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's possible they looked all those kinds of places, whatever was available. But how could they find him? Remember, there's a
Yeah.
huge crowd of people there. He didn't have a fluorescent T-shirt with the name of a town on the back. Everybody looks the same.
Mhm.
So, and they didn't have time to put his picture on an olive oil jar. Missing. Yeshua's. But they found him in the temple. Isn't it always the last place you look?
Oh,
All right, and he's in the temple, but surprise, surprise, he's sitting in the midst of the teachers, both listening to them and asking them questions. Now, the situation is this: on the Sabbath and on feast days, the rabbis would lecture in the covered porches of the court of the women, the outermost courtyard of the shrine. So anybody could be there except for Gentiles. Edersheim states that Jesus could not have been found among the doctors after the close of the feast because he thinks that they wouldn't have been there after. But other sources say that they stayed after the feast and did that same kind of thing too. So I think it's okay to think that that occurred after the feast. Sproul and others point out that it was customary for the visiting rabbis, scholars, theologians of the day to remain in the city to discuss matters of theology. And they were all in a room talking back and forth, discussing their theological theories. So that was common. But they come and find Jesus sitting in the middle of it. Now, it says Jesus was listening and asking questions. Was he listening out of courtesy, or was he listening because he was learning?
Right. Yeah, too. But but you didn't think about this about the law. You didn't think about that.
Yeah, because he's also asking
Yeah.
questions. Yeah. So I think he is learning. I think that's a part, goes back to what Luke had said before. He's learning from them, but also asking questions. Is he asking test questions, or is he asking questions to comprehend? I think probably the latter. And maybe, as Joe said, asking questions to kind of get them to think differently. But think of the opportunity of being in Jerusalem, what that meant to someone who was just becoming of age in the Jewish faith.
Marcia just said a very good term, cultural apologetics. No matter what Jesus was, Jesus lived in the culture of
Yeah.
Jerusalem. And he had to learn and had to grow under that culture.
Right.
That was part of the culture. And he had to do that. He did it with
And he
wisdom.
used the culture, the the traditions of like the people, the rabbis being there speaking to gain his own knowledge in the temple. Yeah. I'm so glad you guys are facing this way. I was just distracted by a deer. He's gone. Don't worry. Now, the rabbinical way of teaching was rather Socratic. It was by asking questions and getting answers, which is
The best
an
way.
excellent way of teaching. It's a way in which people will remember what is learned. Now, what does his position in the midst of the teachers indicate?
He's sitting, which is the position of authority.
Yeah. And he's in the midst, which means what? If I said he's in the middle,
Just
what would that indicate?
They were surrounding.
Yeah. So he's the center of attention.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not saying he was being authoritative over them, but he certainly was the one who was asking the most questions and answering questions so that the focus was on him. Now, John Gill points out something interesting. He says that the principal doctors, and by that he means educated people,
Mhm.
at this time were Hillel and Shammai. If you know anything about Jewish rabbis and the influences that they had on the times of Jesus, those two are familiar names. The one, the president, the other vice president of the council, the Sanhedrin. And Rabbi Simeon, the son of Hillel, who succeeded him in office, and Rabbi Judah and Rabbi Joshua, the sons of Bethira, Jonathan ben Uziel, the author of the Chaldee paraphrase, and Rabbi Johanan ben Zakkai. Now, those are names that are unfamiliar, but he's basically pointing out some of the most famous rabbis in history that were alive at that time probably were there. So, he's sitting in the midst of the elite of the Jewish intelligentsia. The Sanhedrin sat in a semicircle form so they could see one another. Before them sat 3 rows of disciples of the wise men. On each row, there were 3 and 20 men. The first row is next to the Sanhedrin, and the second and third beyond that. Every row they sat according to their superiority and wisdom. On a seat in one of these rows, I think, John Gill says, Christ sat among the scholars. And this may be called sitting among the doctors because these seats were just before them and were in a semicircular form. At least he might be here at first, when upon the questions he put and the answers he made, he was taken particular notice of by the doctors, who might call him up and place him between them. So that's Gill's perspective, suppositions about that. 47, we come to something which is astounding. And all who heard him, that means those big wig doctors, those guys that were the PhDs of their time, all who heard him were amazed at his understanding and his answers. The word translated amazed literally can mean they were beside themselves. His understanding his answers. Now, why was Jesus so astonishing in this discussion? We've already touched on this. Was it because he was God? He already knew all the answers? No, I don't think so. Luke is using this incident as an example of what he told us already in verse 40. The human development and understanding of Jesus was beyond others his age because of his attitude and lack of hindrance due to the sin nature. Because he had no sin nature, because he had such a positive attitude, he knew more. R.C. Sproul says, Jesus didn't have the slightest influence of original sin in his life. His thinking was not for 1 second clouded by darkness, because for all of his 12 years, Jesus had loved the Lord his God with his entire mind. Jesus didn't need to rely on his divine nature to astound anyone. He was perfect in his humanity. Jesus knew his Father better than anyone ever has, even as a 12-year-old. Verse 48, when they saw him, as Mary and Joseph, they were astonished. And this word is a word that literally means to strike out, to to push something away by a blow, to drive it away. And then it came to mean amazement, astonishment. They were astonished. They were struck out of their senses. They were certainly surprised at finding him in the temple complex, but possibly they were even more surprised at finding him in such an honored position among such learned rabbis. And his mother said to him, "Son, why have you treated us this way?" Some translations may say child, but this word doesn't mean anything so much as age as it does of dependency. In other words, it's looking at him, you are dependent on us. In other words, we're still your parents. Why have you treated us this way, to let us go off and not know where you were? Behold, your father and I have been anxiously looking for you, are looking for you. They had a major anxiety attack trying to find him. Now, some might be disturbed by the fact that Joseph is called the father of Jesus here, but he is the man who raised Jesus. And so Joseph was his father. A Jewish axiom stated, not he that begets, but he that brings up is the father. And it's possible that Mary even pulled Jesus aside to address him in this way. Verse 49, and he said to them, why is it that you are looking for me? These are Jesus's first recorded words. Why are you looking for me? You should have known where I was. The implied answer is, to seek for me was an inadvertence on your part. It should have been occurred to you at once that you would find me here. And he goes on to say, did you not know that I had to be, and my translation says, in my father's house. If you notice, the word house is in italics. Some say business, italics. In other words, that word is not there in the Greek. The Greek says, did you not know that of the father of me, it was necessary for me to be. So that could indicate house, because that's where he was. Or I think more likely had to be about what my father is about, which would be, I think, business would be a good word there. And he said, he used the word, the Greek word dei, D-E-I, which was necessary. It had to be. I had to be doing this. It was necessary for me to be doing this. By using the word father, of course, he indicates the intimate personal relationship to God the Father. And notice the contrast. Mary says, your father and I have been looking for you. Or how do you treat your father and I? And Jesus says, well, I had to be about my father's business. I had to be doing my father's thing. Because of the sacrifice of Jesus the Messiah, we have to consider that we have been brought ourselves into a relationship of sonship to God the Father. It could also be said of us, could it not, that we ought to be about our Father's business. Verse 50, but they did not understand the statement which he had made to them. So much throughout the Gospels, people don't understand. Well, what's he talking about? I don't know. And this is the first of 3 times that hearers don't understand what Jesus is saying in the Gospel of Luke. How could they not understand with all that they had seen? I mean, think back of what's happened just in this chapter.
They just get on the regularity of life, right?
Yeah.
They get back, they kind of put those things behind them.
Because we see things, we see the huge things happening one after another, but we don't realize that there are long periods in between when it's just normal life. John Calvin says this to that question. Though they were not wholly unacquainted with Christ's heavenly origin, yet they did not comprehend in every respect how he was intent on executing his heavenly Father's commands, for his calling had not yet been expressly revealed to them. So they didn't know what was going to happen. They didn't know what Jesus was going to do. All they knew is who he was. And I think this statement, verse 50, seems to demonstrate that the source again of this material was Mary herself, that Luke had gotten from her. All right, verse 51. And he went down with them Everything's down from Jerusalem and came to Nazareth. Oops, I forgot to change the pictures. There's Jesus in the temple. There's Mary confronting him. And he went down with them and came to Nazareth, and he continued in subjection to them. Isn't that interesting? He voluntarily placed himself in submission to Mary and Joseph, even though he had just declared that he had to be about his father's business. Think about it. That also was his father's business, wasn't it? To be in submission to Mary and Joseph.
Question.
Yeah.
We're used to calling God our Father, but do you think that played a part that Jesus referred to God as his Father? Because before that, I don't have the best memory, and please correct me, but it seems like Father was referred to like Abraham and the spiritual giants, but not God.
Yeah, exactly. God was not referred to as Father. Jesus is the one that communicates. And when he does communicate that God is his Father, how do the religious leaders react? They want to kill him because he's claiming God as his Father. But Jesus also communicates to his followers that God is also their Father. Not in the same way, obviously, as Jesus, but that in a relationship that we have, he now is our Father.
Kind of like the Lord's Prayer.
Yeah.
to our Father.
Yeah. He said, here's how I pray. Our Father. What? Our Father? What do you mean? You can't call God our Father. Yeah, you can. Because now you're in a relationship with him. Does that address your question?
Yeah, I think, yeah, am I reading that? That's why I think they probably were so confused.
Yeah. Yeah, you're, and that's good to bring that up, how unusual that would have been. And of course, as I promised you before, this is the last mention of Joseph. Don't see him again. And his mother treasured all these things in her heart. She put all these things together in her heart, in her memory. It was her, now she moved from baby book to child book. The record of Jesus in her head. Verse 52, and Jesus kept increasing in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and man. Similar to what has been said before in verse 40. Compare the two. He's increasing in wisdom. He's increasing in stature. Now those two are flipped. And then in favor with God is the same as grace of God. But now we have added to that, he's increasing in favor with men, because now he is living among men as a man. So that's an important part of his life. John Piper said, so it seems to me that the main teaching of the passage is that Jesus now recognizes his unique sonship to God, just what Joe was saying before, and that his mission will require of him a devotion to God's purposes so great that it takes precedence over the closest family ties. He must follow his calling, even if it brings pain and misunderstanding. All right, any final comments or questions?
So we're surmising like between 12 and 30, probably on the earlier side, Joseph passed away, apparently was much older than Mary.
Yeah, that's kind of the supposition that he might have been older. But it's based only on the fact that he doesn't survive. We don't really know
He
what
was
it is.
actually the head of the household thereafter.
Yeah.
as well.
Yeah.
Now the responsibilities and everything.
Yeah. That's right. John?
I'm just going back to the point that said how confusing this must have been for everybody. Bringing right back to that word wisdom. Proverbs 1:10, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom and the knowledge of the Holy One of understanding. Jesus understood as long as very faced on. Everyone else was like, what's going on out there?
Yeah.
What's it all about?
Yeah. And it's hard for us maybe to understand how little they understood, because we know everything that happened after. But for them at that time, it had to really blow their minds.
We have 20/20 hindsight. They didn't.
Yeah, Joe?
And you have to remember, it wasn't until after the resurrection, his brother didn't believe.
Yeah,
He
exactly.
was mad.
Yeah.
He'd be locked up. in
They
the
thought he was
jail
crazy.
asylum.
Right. All right, next week, next couple weeks, I'm going to be speaking other places. So Dave's going to fill in with Luke 3. And unless he wants to finish my slides, which is a comparison of Hannah and Mary, and you can just look at those if you want, and comparing John the Baptist and Jesus and stuff like that. But I'll leave that up to him. All right. Thank you, Lord, for these accounts of the life of Jesus. They're so not only interesting, but impactful to us to understand who Jesus is. And we thank you for Luke's writing of them. And we pray that we might be, as Jesus said of himself, that we might be about your business.
Yes.
That might be the focus of our lives. We ask that you would accomplish these things according to your plan. In Jesus' name, amen.
And the
Hey,
mind.
Bill?
Yeah.
Is there anywhere that it says, what he did between that age of 12 and 30? We know he probably went to the temple and all that, which was normal, but
No, nothing that's factual. There are a lot of people, a lot of made up
the only
stories.
thing that I can refer to is what they say about him being the carpenter's son, which implies, but it's not necessarily so, that he learned that trade.
Yeah, and that's,
Because that was common back then.
that's likely, because that's what, yeah.
You learned whatever trade your parents had.
Right.
And the religion